We wanted to acknowledge here at the beginning of the 1988 Tops podcast that we stand with respect and in solidarity with protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement. We recognize the Black lives lost due to police brutality and racist violence. This podcast delves into nostalgia, and we don't acknowledge enough that the old days were not just. Baseball as an institution was not and is not fair to black players and other players of color.
The subject of today's episode, Jeffrey Leonard, was born in 1955 and went pro in the 70s. He is described in articles as having a difficult personality. Jeffrey surely dealt with institutional racism in the minor leagues and dealt directly with racism from an all-star teammate with the Giants. Because it was the 1980s, not much was made of it. Even the nickname that Matt and I cringed at in this episode, Penitentiary Face, was given to Leonard by a white teammate. Jeffrey faced abuse in St. Louis due to his performance in home run trot, and as we have seen recently in the righteous indignation around bat flips and celebration, there's a racial undertone and coded message around baseball's unwritten rules and playing the game the, quote, right way.
Now, baseball still has a problem with race in 2020. Baseball has a declining number of black players as a percentage, down to less than 8% in 2019. And last year, 11 teams did not have a single black player on their opening day roster. And there are only two black managers in Major League Baseball.
While we started this podcast in the absence of live sports to talk about something other than current events, we have to acknowledge that we all need to do more to address racial inequality, both in baseball and in America. To reiterate, Black Lives Matter, and we promise to do a better job of calling out racism and fighting for racial justice in all walks of our lives.
This is 1988 Tops, where every card has a story to tell. Your hosts are David McKellis and Matt Kuzma. Let's play ball. Welcome back to 1988 Tops. David, what's our card for this week?
Matt, our card for this week is Jeffrey Leonard, number 570. Jeffrey Leonard played for the San Francisco Giants in 1987. If we look at this card, we have Jeffrey with a majestic mustache.
Yeah, this is an excellent mustache.
Very good mustache. Looking probably at a pitcher, giving him a stare down, using his bat to scratch his back. So it's a good look.
Yeah, I also like that he's holding it over his head like he's unsheathing a sword, like he's William Wallace or something, like pulling the sword from it's an unusual look for a baseball card.
It's a very good look as well, with the black gloves, black sweatshirt under the jersey.
Yeah.
It's a tough look.
And the very black mustache. I mean, it's a good look. This is a very fashionable card.
Matt, I picked Jeffrey Leonard this week because even though we're only a few episodes in, I have this fear that I don't want to run through all of the big names and all of the all-stars from 1987 and all of the Hall of Famers. And so I was looking for somebody who had an interesting season, who was maybe involved in the playoffs that year. And I'm going to admit a little bit of naivete here. I was 7 years old in 1987, and the playoffs in 1987 in October, I probably was not allowed to stay awake for much of them. So although I know the participants, I wasn't fully aware of everything that happened. And Jeffrey Leonard was the MVP of the National League Championship Series, but he played for the San Francisco Giants, who lost that series. They lost in 7 games, and he is the last LCS or World Series loser to win the MVP of one of those series.
Okay.
So he had a very impressive LCS. Knowing that, I went back and was looking at some videos of his and some of his statistics. He had a pretty good season in 1987. He was an all-star. So if we want to go to the back of the card here and check him out, 19 home runs, 63 RBIs, 16 stolen bases, 280 average. Nothing spectacular, and probably that's why, as a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, I wasn't that interested in this card. But if you look back at some of his earlier seasons, he had some good power and speed numbers. In 1983 and 84, hitting 20 home runs a season, which at the time was not really nothing to sneeze at. That was good enough for top 10 in each of those seasons. Nowadays, that's 20 home runs for an outfielder is really, you kind of expect that. But these were
Yeah,
different times for power hitters.
and hitting 302 in 1984 as well. So for
Yes.
average and power.
Yeah, and having some good speed to go along with it. Jeffrey was an all-star in 1987. Those stats kind of don't show how good of a first half he had. The first half of his 1987 season was really impressive. But maybe let's go a little bit back to some of his background and why I thought he was interesting. By this season, he was playing as number 00, which I did not realize this, and it made it a little bit confusing watching some of his older videos from prior seasons that he changed his number a lot. He started as number 51 when he was a rookie with the Dodgers, and then it fell from year to year. He went to 46 to 30 to 26. At one point, he wore number 20 after the Giants fired Frank Robinson out of respect for Frank Robinson, as that was his number. And then he changed it to 00 for the 1987 season.
It is a very like Dennis Rodman kind of move, like just seeing the strange numbers.
Yeah, 00 is also kind of an intimidating number to look at. That's not just 0, but 00. Love it. He had some good nicknames. He was known as a penitentiary face.
Okay.
The only reason I repeat that is that he seemed to not take it as offensive, but at one point later in his career, when he said he wanted to be more of a team leader, he asked to be called correctional facility face instead of penitentiary face. And he was given that name by a teammate, and he had kind of a somber look and a mustache, and people, don't love that nickname.
Yeah, I don't love that either. But there's another nickname you have listed here, though, which is Hackman.
Yes, but with no K.
Okay.
Just Hacman, Hackman, like Pac-Man.
Pac-Man, which still would have been pretty big in 1987, although somewhat on the downswing with the launch of Nintendo.
Yes, he was known to take swings and not take pitches. So first pitch, he was often swinging. And if you check the back of this card, he, in 1987, only walked 21 times, which is pretty low. Struck out 68 times. And earlier in his career, he was in the top 10 in most strikeouts in a season in a couple of those early 80s years. So yeah, takes a lot of swings, known as the Hackman. He even, by this point in 1987, was well known as the Hackman, had it on his jacket. So when he went out for batting practice, it said Hackman across his back.
I love it.
He grew up in Philadelphia. If we're looking back at the back of the card here, grew up in Philadelphia. He was a good basketball and football player, and as well as a good baseball player. His dad had played like kind of a semi-pro baseball in the early half of the 20th century. Because he was in Philadelphia, he really wanted to stay home, play for the Phillies. They had told him that they were going to draft him, and then somehow he ended up getting passed up. But he was still playing high school ball, and a Dodgers scout came out and gave him his card. Jeffrey goes home afterwards, tells his dad, like, yeah, some scout came out and was talking to me, and it turned out that he had left the business card of the scout in the pants that he was wearing that he had left back at his school. So he runs back to school, finds the card in the stack of dirty laundry, and the rest is history. He goes on to play for the Dodgers. Doesn't get to play in his hometown Phillies, but gets started with the Dodgers, traded to the Astros, where he's second in Rookie of the Year voting in 1979. Did not like being rotated in the outfield with the Astros, and so he asked to be traded and was traded to the Giants. And you have this kind of a love-hate relationship between the Hackman and his teammates and coaches, demanding trades. He was very close with Frank Robinson, who was his coach in the mid-'80s in San Francisco. Then a new coach comes in, Roger Craig. And you have some kind of... He could be a little bit difficult with coaches, and we'll see that in 87 in the playoffs too, how he could be demanding. It seems like he's the kind of guy who tells it like it is. And somebody asked him once about this and about his personality, and he said, if my grandma makes me a cake for my birthday and says, "Do you like it?" He says, "I wouldn't have a problem saying, 'Grandma, this cake sucks.'" So there's some really there's
Special.
yeah, he's a special guy. He's a very outspoken person, and it seems like he kind of messed with some of the younger players and could get into some arguments. There's some anecdotes about him getting into fights with Dan Gladden and Will Clark, and later in his career, he calls Will Clark a racist, and and that was in response to Will Clark having called him a cancer in the clubhouse. So there's clearly some difficulties with his teammates, but Roger Craig, who's kind of an old school guy, said he was a great leader and a great team captain. So there's a little bit of rubbing some people the wrong way, but still being recognized as a leader and being well liked.
I see here that we do have to ask the question and go back to the recurring segment for 1988 Topps. Cocaine? Question mark?
The cocaine question, the ever-present recurring theme of cocaine. This, I said earlier in this episode that I was a little bit naive as a 7-year-old with these cards, that I didn't really know a lot of what was happening in the broader world, and wasn't reading the newspaper every day. But in searching for Jeffrey Leonard, I did find reference to the Pittsburgh drug trials. And Matt, as a young person following the Pittsburgh Pirates, I didn't know if you knew much about that at all, or what you knew of that. I just thought it was. I immediately was, of course, gonna click on that link.
Yes. So at the time, as a kid, I didn't know much. The Pirates were my team, but I was living in Kansas, and I wasn't really following the news either. I was 10 and 11 at that time, and so not really much. In later years, I did learn a lot more about the Pittsburgh drug trials, especially because they involve the mascot of the Pittsburgh Pirate, Parrot, who is one of the best mascots around. I just thought that was incredible. The sports are larger than life in Pittsburgh always, and the thought that the mascot is involved in a huge baseball-wide drug ring was just pretty incredible to me.
So I had no idea about this at all, and did some reading and found even some court documents from that drug case. And of course, you and I had the impression that there were some players in the 1980s who were on cocaine. I did not realize that it went to the point of them testifying in court and getting immunity for prosecution. Jeffrey Leonard was one of those players who testified and was given immunity from criminal prosecution for his involvement with cocaine dealers. 7 people ended up indicted in this Pittsburgh drug trials, and it seems like most of them pled guilty, except there was one guy named Curtis Strong who was a caterer for the Philadelphia Phillies. He had a kind of brash attorney who tried to turn this into a trial against baseball and say that baseball had a drug problem, which it clearly did. Keith Hernandez testified that 40% of players were on cocaine. Some of the big names that we're going to talk about in this series, Dave Parker, Lonnie Smith, Tim Raines, were involved in this trial. And Strong ended up being convicted. I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about the Pittsburgh drug trials maybe in the Lonnie Smith episode. There's a really good ESPN 30 for 30 episode about the Pittsburgh drug trials. But it was really interesting to me because you have Jeffrey Leonard, and if you look at his stat line, you would never guess from 1985 that he was involved in a federal drug trial. The players who end up testifying end up getting some kind of suspension or fine, but the suspensions were commuted if they paid a fine. So Leonard paid 10% of his salary and did some community service. They were subjected to random drug testing for the rest of their career, but he then plays in 1986. So he doesn't really face much retribution at all. And instead you have kind of 7 low-level drug dealers who end up getting convicted or doing some time in jail while all of the players are let off. It really led to some almost farcical quotes the judge said that the players have learned the evils of fooling around with drugs in a way that no advertising campaign could accomplish. And, let's get real here. In 1986, did they really solve any drug problem in baseball? Lonnie Smith said that even though he was going to be subjected to those drug tests later in 1986, he said he was never tested throughout that season. One of the players involved ends up dying of a heart attack due to his cocaine addiction. That's Rod Scurry. And there was no full drug testing program in Major League Baseball until 2012. So Peter Uberoth basically said, we won this battle against drugs in baseball. And as we'll see later on, this is right before the steroid boom takes off, and they really did nothing about drugs in baseball.
Okay, enough about drugs though, David. I think that what we really need to talk about is an epic brawl that Jeffrey Leonard and the Giants were involved with the Cardinals around that time, so 1986. So we're not at 1987 yet. But I checked this out on YouTube, and there's a 10-minute long link, and we'll have it in the show notes. And really, people, you got to watch this because it's black and white footage.
You have this. First, you have Vince Coleman, who, spoiler alert, at some point, he's another of my favorite players in this 1988 top set. The Cardinals were up pretty big, and Vince Coleman was still running and trying to steal bases. Coleman was in the middle of, I think, a 3-year streak where he stole 100 bases in each season, and it just kind of seemed like he was padding his stats. So you have this pitch go behind Coleman. Coleman does not take kindly to it. Pitcher gets thrown out of the game. You end up having this little round Whitey Herzog running onto the field and screaming at Roger Craig, another old guy. Both these guys are probably in their 60s.
Yeah, in their 60s and look like them. I mean, in their 60s in 1987, 86, when everybody looks a lot older.
Yes, and Whitey Herzog ends up in a wrestling match with one of the Giants' rookies. He gets tossed to the ground. Jeffrey Leonard is also involved. I couldn't pick it out in the video, but I've read that he threw the pitching coach to the ground. So you have guys, getting body slammed all over the place. You have Tommy Herr gets 8 stitches in his head because he got kicked in the head. And it's really worth the watch. It was anytime you have the managers ready to throw punches or getting into shoving match, it was one of these ridiculous baseball brawls.
Yeah. I mean, the old guys yelling at each other, getting in each other's faces. It was great. And then the end, Vince Coleman, one of the other Cardinals is basically wrestled Vince Coleman to the ground and is on his back to keep him down. And then
they carry him off the
from
field
behind to carry him, gets his feet off the ground and carries him into the dugout. It's hilarious.
The Giants play the St. Louis Cardinals in the 1987 playoffs. You have this backdrop, and it's great if you watch this full 10-minute long video. At the end, the announcer says, "This is the kind of thing that is remembered for a long, long time." And it was so great having watched that after I was already watching Leonard's performances against the Cardinals, where the fans are he just becomes this massive heel and kind of relishes in that in the 87 playoffs.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get to that. I know that, as you had mentioned, he was an all-star in the 1987 season, so he had a good season. But I really think the NLCS is just it really stands out as one of the great heel performances and top performances anyway.
So leading into this playoff series, Leonard had a really good first half of the season and a really weak second half of the season. He hit 3 home runs in the second half after 16 in the first half. He hit 50 points better the first half of the season than the second half. In September and October, he ends the season hitting 200 in those months, just 206, hits 2 home runs, 4 RBIs, a really weak end of the season, goes 2 for 21 to close out. So goes into the NLCS, the Giants versus the Cardinals. Before game 1, he looks at the team sheet, and Jeffrey Leonard is on the bench. And Mike Aldretti had gotten the start. And Matt, I don't know if you remember Mike Aldretti.
Was he the commentator from American Gladiators? Oh, that's Mike. That's Mike Adamley.
Yes.
It's Mike Adamley. That's Chicago broadcaster Mike Adamley. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Mike Aldretti had a very good season, but he wasn't a superstar or anything. He wasn't the kind of guy that is starting for a World Series team. You wouldn't think. One previous team that Jeffrey Leonard played for had made it to the playoffs, and in that situation, he had been benched. And he had kind of vowed that he wasn't going to let that happen again. Also, if you look back at his stats that season, he had hit 340 versus the Cardinals in 12 regular season games. He had hit 423 at Busch Stadium. So he was really lighting up the Cardinals. He said that he goes in to talk to Roger Craig and tells him, this isn't the regular season. I know what happened back there. And Craig agrees to let him start. But he said that Jeffrey Leonard had to go tell Mike Aldretti that he was starting. So knowing what we know about Jeffrey Leonard, he's a bit of an intimidating figure. He's 6'4" or something. And I can imagine that he just kind of walked up and said, hey, I'm in the lineup. But
guess what?
this story could have gone very, very differently if he had gone in and struck out 4 times. So he goes on to have one of the best losing efforts in a major league postseason, not to mention just a swagger and this home run trot that just infuriated St. Louis Cardinal fans, to the extent that I texted a friend, a Cardinal fan friend, that I was watching these Jeffrey Leonard home runs and I was telling him how much I was enjoying the trot. I did not mean to troll him, but the response I got was expletive. My friend said that 12-year-old him did not forgive Jeffrey Leonard.
Well, I love what we've done this week, David, is we've flipped the listener mailbag and we've started to mail our listeners.
Yes.
So if you're listening out there, you may end up getting texts from us with questions about these cards.
We've never met. Don't ask how I got your phone number. I don't.
We encourage people to mail us, but we could just mail you. So just look out.
Yeah. So let's walk through this a little bit. Game 1 of this series, after he has to tell Mike Aldretti, hey, buddy, I'm starting. Sorry. They are at St. Louis. Leonard sees that the Giants' family members are seated really far away from the field, and he said that it bothered him and it bothered the team. He hits a home run in the 4th inning to tie the game. And after he hits the home run, he said that the people were booing before he even got to second base. And Leonard has this thing called one flap down. And Matt, I did not really know what that meant, but as soon as I started typing Jeffrey Leonard in, it was auto-filling one flap down.
Well, so in watching it, if I could just describe it for the listener, he trots slowly after hitting the home run, and he keeps his left arm at his side the entire run, and he's then with a normal kind of motion, kind of pumping his right arm, just as you normally would if you were jogging, but then his left arm completely at his side as he's circling the bases. And it just looks weird. It doesn't look threatening. It's not intimidating. It's not. So when I first saw it, I don't get, why, is the flap, is it because is it a bird reference? Is it the one flap of a plane? Is this just a flap as a name for an arm? That's just like a slang for an arm in some cases. I just didn't get it really.
Yeah, and I think that the one flap down name came from others, and Hackman didn't necessarily give it that name. He said that the background of it was that he hit a home run in 1986, and the first base coach was kind of joking around with him and backed away from first base, so he didn't come by to give him a high five as he went by. And he only went to give him a high five after Leonard was already past and his arm was all the way back down. And first base coach slaps the hand when it's down, and Leonard just leaves it there. And the next day, opposing players say, hey, Hack, is your arm okay? And they thought that his arm was injured, and that's why he had left it down. But it doesn't really explain why people would get so angry about it, except that it was just, I think, partially a bit of the animosity from '86 and the fighting then, a bit of the anger that this player seems to be just blasting the ball in the NLCS off of your pitchers. And then a little bit of just the kind of stoic stare as he's running, and he slows down as he reaches home plate.
Yeah.
But he really turns into a villain.
Yeah, I would say too, and I don't want to go too far on here against Cardinals fans, but Cardinals fans, let's just say very traditionalists. And so very much fans of the game and the way that it should be played.
Yes.
And so I think that this was anything that was kind of countercultural doesn't really fly in St. Louis when it comes to baseball. So I think that this just seemed like, oh, that's just not proper. That's just not how it should be done, and taking offense at it. And then especially, yeah, when the guy's like, he's jacking the ball and, hitting big home runs against your team, like I can see them putting that together, not to mention if he had, tackled your pitching coach the year before.
Yeah, there's a lot going into that, but there's a lot of anger directed at Jeffrey, and he tended to enjoy it. So the Cardinals win game 1, even though Leonard hits a home run in the 4th inning. Game 2, he said that the fans were booing him as soon as they saw his jacket. So he had a jacket that said Hackman on it, and he would wear it during batting practice. He even tells Kevin Mitchell later in MVP of the National League, he says, if you don't think the booing is bad, you should wear my jacket. And Mitchell puts the jacket on, and as soon as he steps out of the dugout, the fans just start booing him because it says Hackman on the back of his jacket. So he runs back in, gives Leonard his jacket back. Okay, so game 2, Hackman goes 3 for 4, hits another home run to lead off the 4th, does another one flap down. The Giants win. The series goes 1-1, and they're going back to San Francisco. Chili Davis, as they're leaving, calls St. Louis a cow town, and he maybe used more colorful language than that.
Leonard, to be fair, not wrong. Known for its barbecue.
I like St. Louis, but it is known for its barbecue. Leonard says he loves the booze and is, happy that they got a win, so they're going to come back to St. Louis at some point. So he's already riling up the fans for that return trip. Game 3 back in San Francisco, he hits another home run and does his trot. In his next at bat, Bob Forsch throws at him and hits him right in the back. The Cardinals go on to win that game, take a 2-1 series lead. Leonard said, the getting thrown at, he expected it. He didn't affect his game at all, except that if you look at game 4, he hits another home run, and there is much less of a trot in game 4.
So maybe getting hit by the pitch could have actually affected him.
Yeah, and Whitey Herzog said, Forshee didn't say anything, but he hit Leonard right in the butt, and that kind of put a kibosh on that stuff a little bit, and it might have been a turning point. Game 4, Leonard hits another home run. That's 4 games in a row with a home run. The Giants win game 4. They go on to win game 5 as well. And Leonard goes 0 for 4, so no home runs in that game. But they go back to St. Louis to finish the series. And game 6 and 7 are back in St. Louis. In game 6, Leonard gets beer dumped on him in the outfield and refuses to change his shirt. He also said that he had batteries. Cowbells were thrown because maybe people thought that they were throwing them at Chili Davis.
The Cowtown reference, yeah.
They threw change and frozen hot dogs. Change and frozen hot dogs and cowbells. So he clearly had gotten in the heads of some fans and maybe into the heads of some opposing players. But seems like the luck kind of finally runs out. In game 7, the Giants lose 6-0. Roger Craig decided to sit Mike Krukow and save him for the first game of the World Series, which is probably always a mistake. Going into a game 7 must win. And instead, the starter, Atlee Hammaker, gives up 4 runs in 2 innings, including a Jose Oquindo 3-run homer. So the Giants lose that series 4-3. Leonard still goes 2 for 4. He ends up batting .417 in that playoff series, tied a playoff record for hits with 10, total bases, and home runs, and became the first player in baseball history to hit home runs in 4 straight playoff games. So he's named the MVP, but after Game 7, supposedly the Giants team is watching TV and they see Ozzie Smith on TV being interviewed about the great victory, and someone threw a ball and broke the TV. Leonard said, I don't know who threw it. All I know is the TV was gone.
That's good denial.
He gets named the MVP and has to go talk to a press conference about winning the MVP in a losing effort, and it really seemed to kind of bother him. And he said that he didn't even like to have that trophy in his house. He gave it to his stepson.
That's understandable. So, I mean, four home runs, 4 games in a row in the playoffs, an amazing performance. After 1987, how long did he stay in the majors? Where else did he end up playing?
Yeah, after 1987, he gets traded in 1988 to the Brewers. And even though he had been a starter and a pretty good player, he was traded for kind of a backup utility guy, Ernie Riles. We'll talk about Ernie Riles someday. But he's traded for Ernie Riles, plays half a season in Milwaukee, is fine, and then goes to the Seattle Mariners, where he has another all-star season in 1989, hits 24 home runs, and is kind of brought in to play with Ken Griffey Jr., who's apparently a big fan of Jeffrey Leonard's, and they got along well. But he only plays that 1989 season, makes the All-Star game, and 1990 is his last year in the big leagues. So Leonard is still seen as a bit of a Giants legend. He, partially for this series, the Giants brought him back on as a community ambassador.
I love that.
And watching an interview with him, it was hard not to like him. He in a lot of these interviews, he reads as a guy trying to rile people up and willing to take that villainy. He talked about doing curtain calls in that 1987 series, and mostly he said you could read his lips in some of these videos, and you see him just say, "Make them wait," and he's making the opponents wait because the fans are still cheering in Candlestick for him to get him to come out, and he's just trying to get in the heads of the opposing pitchers. So even though he didn't have that NLCS trophy in the house, it really hurt him to look at it. He said it was an achievement, but I always relate it to the loss, and that loss really hurt. And they lost that series in 7 games. The Cardinals go on to lose the World Series, so Leonard has to kind of sit and think, what if would they have been able to beat the Twins in that World Series? As a community ambassador, though, in 2012, the Giants asked Leonard to come back to throw out the first pitch for Game 6 of the NLCS in San Francisco. In that NLCS, the Giants were down 3-2, and appropriately, they were matched up against the St. Louis Cardinals. Leonard throws out the first pitch in Game 6, and the Giants go on to win that game. They win Game 7 and go on to win the World Series.
Love it. Great way to end it. Well, thank you, David. Hackman. I'm going to get a Hackman jacket. I would love that. I think that's...
Yeah, you got to get the
we should all have one.
double zero
Oh,
Hackman
man.
jacket.
I'm in. Well, thank you for that story. Thank you to all the listeners at home. If you have requests for a particular card from 1988 Topps that you would like to discuss on the show or submit a question, please contact us at 1988topspodcast@gmail.com. And we will see you next week.